What's going on, everyone? Today I wanted to talk about Sony, specifically the state of PlayStation. Over the course of this generation, a lot has been said about Sony and how their output in game delivery is faltered. Whether the cause is a focus on live service games or the turbulent state of the world, many suggest that Sony has dropped the ball and failed to live up to the success it accomplished with the PS4 generation. Today, I want to talk about whether Sony has truly fallen off or failed this generation. So let's talk about it. Sony's gaming business exists because of a deal gone wrong. Nintendo and Sony had planned to collaborate on what would have been Nintendo's first disc-based console. This would have been a significant change for Nintendo, but they got cold feet and backed out, leaving Sony with the technology and the meal at the table, so Sony ate it. Instead of walking away, Sony repurposed its design, and the PlayStation 1 was born. When this console dropped, it was an awesome piece of tech. I remember debating between the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn for hours at Toys R Us. In the end, I went with the PlayStation, and honestly, I never looked back. This system delivered smash hit after smash hit. Resident Evil, Crash, Twisted Metal, Cool Borders, Pandemonium, Legacy of Kain Blood Omen, Jet Moto. This generation just rocked. It was fantastic. But honestly, it did nothing to prepare us for the moment Sony claimed its place in the gaming industry, the PS2. When the PS2 dropped, it sold like ice on the sun. A gaming system with a DVD player, everyone had to have one. This system became the hottest thing on the market, moving and selling an incredible 160 million units. Yet, when you climb so far, the fall can be brutal. Sony reached for the PS3 and faltered and slipped. They stopped before falling too far, of course, because the PS3 launched and the advanced cell processor and new architecture designed proved to be an issue for design, proved to be an issue for creation. However, this new system was a nightmare to design for. Developers had non-stop problems trying to code and optimize for the system. Some multi-platform DLCs took months or even years to show up on the PS3, and honestly, that's if they even did. So, Sony learned from its mistakes and marched into the PS4 generation with a new idea and a new system. They sat back and watched as Don Matrix sought to tank the Xbox brand and responded masterfully. What happened at the PS4 reveal E3 was brutal. Some call it the day that Xbox broke, others the day that PlayStation rose. The PS4 came out from the gate firing on all cylinders and racked up a total of 117.2 million units moved, quickly becoming the second best-selling PlayStation console of all time. As Sony rode into the PS5 era, the world changed. The pandemic meant we were all locked in our homes and gaming became our escape. This global state also meant fewer people were making, building, shipping, and selling the PS5 when it released. This created a long stream of issues, from supply constraints to scalping. This brings us to where we are today, on the other side of the midpoint of this generation. So let's look what happened and where the PlayStation brand is now. When the PS4 generation started, Sony was known for epic blowout conferences and events. If Sony had games to tout, they showed up and it was amazing. From live orchestras for God of War to flute players from Ghost of Tsushima, Sony conferences were spectacular events, and then they went silent. Suddenly, the loudest voice in the room no longer spoke. Whether it was because they felt they no longer needed to, or out of worry over the mistakes they were starting to make, Sony had gone quiet. This lack of voice and communication has left the community frustrated and feeling like they no longer matter to Sony. It has left the PlayStation player base unsure of what is coming over the next few hills of the journey with this system. Where we once knew what lay ahead of us on the map, now we barely know what lays over the next hill. Sony has decided, for whatever reason, to keep its voice quiet and its games close to the chest. What do you think the reason is Sony went quiet? Let's hear in the comments. Why do you think they stopped talking to us? Then comes the cross-gen question. Another issue presented to the PlayStation fanbase is the number of cross-gen games that straddle the generations. People have claimed that this has held games back, preventing them from being bigger or better than they could be. Yet, when you spend hundreds of millions to make a game, you want as many people as possible to play it. So when the PS5 dropped, the world was in a sick state, and as I said, manufacturing and delivery were far below the normal standards. This made it harder to make, release, and to sell those systems, meaning fewer and fewer people had access to those games at launch. So, to ensure profits were not lost, Sony saddled the gin. I know a lot of people have a problem with this. I, on the other hand, do not. We have reached a point now where graphically, we are on the edge of lifelike quality. We are designing worlds that look and act as realistically as possible. Soon the only thing that will separate games is the mind of the designers. Allowing others to play those games across multiple generations is no longer as much of an issue. Some games will be for newer generations like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, others will straddle. Now, another one would have to be the live service push, the games as a service model. Sony saw the cash flow of Fortnite, Call of Duty, and Bungie and said, yeah, I want that too. What company wouldn't? A game that keeps paying you after its release and after the majority of the work is done. These executives, these non-gamers saw profit margins. We saw another dish on the menu. What Sony didn't understand is that the pool of live service players is not infinite. They're not the whole industry. Most live service players already have their toxic girlfriend or hobbies. Adding 10 or more to this mix isn't going to be viable. Yet they did it anyway. And we know how that fared. Helldivers 2 dropped and nuked the world with its gameplay and combat. We all stood back and wasted bugs and waxed bots for months. This game was a smash hit. Yet for every Helldivers 2, there is a Concord. Concord was an abomination. The market for it was small and uninterested. No one asked for the game, the look, the style, the quality. A purported 400 million mistake that lasted less than 2 weeks. But what about the other projects? Bungie was brought on to surely help Sony's live service titles become hits. Nope. Grand Tour nuked those games faster than the Edge of Fate nuked its player base. Factions, Twisted Metal, Spider-Man Co-op, God of War Online projects, they were all cancelled. Why? Maybe Bungie was worried that if Sony had a huge stable of winning live service games, Marathon and Destiny would have to deliver more. Maybe they would be held to a bigger standard. Maybe they wanted to be the top dog. Or perhaps their managers were incompetent and didn't know what they were doing. We still wait and watch to see what happens to Fair Games and Marathon, but honestly I think at this point, we expect both games to launch to little fanfare. What do you think? Do you think this live service push is something that Sony can overcome? Do you think their mistakes so far are something that's made Sony falter? Let me know in the comments. Now, this is one reason that Sony has moved heavily back into single-player games, a place they should have honestly never left. It's the area where many claim Sony has faltered this generation. A lot of people claim that Sony has released far fewer games this gen, arguing that the PS4 generation was far stronger and had more games. So, let's take a look, shall we? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read off a list of the PS5 games and then the PS4 games, and we're going to compare. So PS5, we have Astro's Playroom, Astrobot, Demon Souls, Destruction All-Stars, Ghost of Tsushima Director's Cut, Ragnarok, GT7, Helldivers 2, Horizon Call of the Mountains and Forbidden West and Dawn Remastered, Miles Morales, Spider-Man 2, Returnal, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, Ghost of Yōtei, Sackboy: A Big Adventure, Last of Us Part 1 Remake, Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, Uncharted Legacy Thieves Collection, and Death Stranding Director's Cut, Death Stranding on the Beach, Rise of the Ronin, Stellar Blade. These are all a combination of Sony titles or Sony-produced titles, and this is just the PS5. So let's look at the PS4 and see what that tells us. Bloodborne, God of War, Ghost of Tsushima, Horizon Zero Dawn, Spider-Man, Last of Us Part 2, Uncharted 4, Uncharted Lost Legacy, Infamous Second Son and First Light, The Last Guardian, Shadows of the Colossus Remake, Days Gone, Ratchet & Clank re-release, GT Sport, Drive Club, Killzone Shadowfall, The Order 1886, Knack 1 and 2, Gravity Rush Remastered, Gravity Rush 2, Concrete Genie, Dreams, Tearaway Unfolded. You're looking at 24 titles versus 25 titles. Remasters and collections are included, so honestly, you're talking the entirety of a generation versus a generation that still has 2 to 3 years left. So when you compare these two lists, there's very little difference between the two generations in terms of first-party output. Both are full of epic releases, and both are full of remasters and remakes. The big difference is that the PS5 still has 2 to 3 years left in its core life cycle for new games, and the PS4 is complete. Had those studios that had been working on live service games instead made single-player games, this generation for Sony would be called an unprecedented success. The thing most people seem to forget is that Sony has bought numerous studios since then. Numerous studios have come on board and either started new games or canceled old ones. For every firewalk, there is an insomniac. So has Sony dropped the ball in this aspect? Well, yes and no. They are on par with last gen, even ahead if current trends continue. But they could have dominated this generation totally had they gone and stayed exclusively single player. That we can 100% agree on. So what does Sony have left? What do they have coming? Let's take a look at their studios and their actual output in the games that we know exist. And remember, several of them have games that we have no idea what they're doing. So we'll start at the top. Naughty Dog. Naughty Dog has Intergalactic and an unannounced second single-player game. Insomniac, well, they're now the Marvel studio. We got Venom, Wolverine, and Spider-Man 3. Santa Monica, God of War, of course, and Corey's working on a new IP, but we have no clue what it is. Sucker Punch just dropped Ghost of Yōtei. Guerrilla, their Horizon and a multiplayer Horizon. Bungie, yeah, Marathon and continued support for Destiny. Team Asobi, we're going to be calling them the Astrobot Studio from now on. Housemarque has Saros. Haven has Fair Games. Poly has GT. Bend has another new unannounced IP. This is one we have no clue about. Bluepoint, an unannounced original title. Firesprite, an unannounced dark narrative-driven horror game. Media Molecule, we don't know. San Diego, they're going to be doing MLB. Nixxes, all they do is PC port, so anything that moves across, and unless Sony bails on PC, we're not going to see them touch anything else. Now, we get into two new studios, but you need to understand both of these studios are going to be live service studios. One is Team LFG, which is the team that was spun off of Bungie that is making Gummy Bears. This is supposedly the best game that Bungie was working on. Then there's Dark Outlaw Games. Formed in March 2025, this new studio is being led by Jason Blundell. So this is the guy that worked on Call of Duty Zombies, so I expect something to come of this. Although this is the outskirts of another studio that was started and stopped, so we'll see how this goes. Then, of course, Sony has a huge plethora of third-party developers. Obviously, Activision and Bethesda are now Xbox, but there's still tons of companies that Sony has worked with for generations. Take-Two, From Software, don't forget Sony owns a stake in Kadokawa, Bandai Namco, Square Enix, Capcom, and Sega. Also, all of these studios have been rumored to be potential acquisitions for Sony for years. Then they have strong third-party partners like Team Ninja, Shift Up, and of course Kojima. Now, I do eventually expect Kojima Studios to be part of PlayStation. Whether people want to hear it or not, Sony will give Kojima whatever the hell he wants because, let's be honest, Kojima is a mad scientist and everything he makes is brilliant and the industry loves him. Let's look at the data. So, for the global market share, as of 2025, Sony holds the largest global market share in the world, with estimates placing them at 45% of the market share. That is almost half of the market share between three studios. This makes them the dominant leader. Now, they also have the best-selling console. Sony PlayStation 5 was the best-selling console of 2024, and by unit sales, by June 2025, PlayStation has shipped over 80.3 million units worldwide, significantly outpacing its direct competitor, Xbox. Revenue? Sony PlayStation division generated approximately $31.7 billion in revenue in fiscal year 2024, or 4.6 trillion yen. This is the highest total for the company. And then exclusive titles, the PlayStation platform continues to boast a strong lineup of critically acclaimed games like God of War, Spider-Man, and Horizon, not to mention a plethora of other titles we have yet to see. And all of them will either end up nominated or winning Game of the Year awards. When you look at the numbers, console sales over the generations, it's staggering and obvious that Sony is truly the number one market share leader. The numbers speak for themselves. PS1 sold 102.4 million. PS2 sold 160.6 million. PS3 sold 87.4 million. Their only Falter. PS4 sold 117.2 million, and PS5, as of June 2025, has sold 80.3 million with 2 to 3 years in its core lifespan left. As of right now, if sales trends continue, the PS5 will surpass the 100 million mark easily. Adding in the fact that GTA 6 will have an impact on sales numbers, PlayStation is set to have another massively successful generation. Sony, with the data shown, is still very much in the lead and in command in this market. Now, in hindsight, looking at individual things or parts of this generation, it's easy to understand why it can seem that Sony has faltered and is losing this generation. Yet if we look at the facts and the data, we can see that even though Sony faltered with its live service push and made major missteps, they are still very much in a position where they can easily recover from this and maintain their current market share, potentially even drastically improving it if they offer special GTA 6 incentives to play on PlayStation. Now this part. This is the scary part, and I left the voice in just for that. Because the scary and sad part altogether is this. With no real competition and Microsoft slowly pulling back from consoles and the market to go more third-party, Sony is left in control now. They are in charge of the marketplace. This means that there is no one to check them and keep them in line. This is bad because Sony can become lethargic and allow things to happen. Things like price increases, lowered quality, and a lack of games. When one company leads the way and has no one to fight for market share against, why would they bother? This aspect scares me. I don't want to pay $1,000 for a console, and I don't want to pay $1,000 for games. But when one company leads the way, it has no one to fight for market share. This is something we could face. So, in conclusion, Sony is still very much on course and very much delivering. Too often we forget the number of studios that Sony has acquired over this generation and the end of the last. These additions have allowed Sony to stay on par with its output from last gen, and they may even surpass it by the end. Also, most people tend to forget that when we were in the middle of the PS4 generation, we asked a lot of the same questions we are asking now. So does this mean that when we hit the PS6 generation, we're going to look back at this generation as a success, another measuring stick, or as a failure? Only time will tell, but so far the measuring stick has not lost an inch. Thank you to everyone that tuned in. A like, a sub, and a comment go a long way. I love doing these videos, and I love discussing games. I honestly find myself doing this more now than I actually do playing games, trying to upgrade my setup and make it as good as possible to deliver the best content possible. So tell me what you agreed with and what you didn't, and let's talk about it in the comments below. So until next time, gamers, I hope whatever games you're playing, whatever games you're loving, keeps you smiling till the very end credits roll. Have a good one.